Would you have an answer to that question? And if so, what would it be?
I've always felt weird about saying, oh, Rochdale, because I'm like, co-ops are natural human things to do. They're as old as humanity, but yes, I don't know all the history.
Yeah, so well, kind of both those things, and both those things tend to happen at the same time. Anybody else?
I guess one thing I often say is that like people that didn't have access to political power and didn't have access to like the normal economy formed co-ops as a form of mutual aid to survive without those other resources.
Yeah, good. That's probably closer to what happened. Yeah, good. Anybody else?
Yeah, no, I think my understanding of the history of co-ops comes from understanding after the abolition of slavery and how difficult it was for anyone to talk about being excluded from an economy. Yeah, people came together for mutual aid, and I don't know if the major big co-ops over in Spain are date further back than that, but those are the two sort of origin stories that I am aware of.
So I feel like, and so I've heard versions of all of those things. I think one thing you often hear, and I think that Janelle probably means this in a much different way, is that, well, cooperation is something natural, and it's just people coming together, doing this natural thing of cooperating, and that's one way of thinking about it, and that gets kind of superimposed and kind of melded with a history that tends to be told as starting with the Rochdale pioneers. So if you ask, like, oh, what was the first kind of modern cooperative? The Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers in 1844 is presented as being the kind of beginning of the modern cooperative movement, which then, of course, goes on to have many other forms, many iterations, many different kinds of politics. But like the thing that we think of as a co-op, and where like the ICA cooperative principles originally derived from, is that society, the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers. And so I kind of started my research wanting to, I don't know, challenge, if we think about Rochdale being here in the middle, to challenge this kind of origin story. We tend to tell these kind of histories because they make what we're doing now seem really purposeful and like it's kind of ordained in some way. So the Rochdale pioneers are a new model, and that's it. That's how it got started in our movement, and that's how we're able to have cooperatives today. And so that's like a very sort of linear, kind of progressive way of telling history, that there's this like point where Rochdale emerges and separates it from everything that came before, right? None of that matters. There's a birth and a moment of origin, and then we get kind of their development up to today. And that development is taken to be, you know, some things happen, there are historical events, but our idea of what a cooperative is kind of stabilized at that point in time. And so to do that, you have to do quite a lot of historical forgetting of what came before Rochdale and what made it possible for Rochdale to emerge and to look the way it did. We also then tend to kind of take some things that happened later and kind of read them back into history. So the kind of basic tenet of I know what's come out of my research is that very much of what we think of as the cooperative is already a legal idea. And it's a legal idea that we kind of read back into history, and I'll come back to kind of explaining what that means. But what I've tried to do, and like I kind of started my inquiry from thinking about, rather than a beginning, what if Rochdale is the outcome of something, right, of some process? And if so, how does that change how we think about what it is? So what's its relationship to what came before? And so there's a couple ways we can look at that. So what tends to get disregarded down here is, for example, Owenism. Owenism was a kind of utopian socialist movement in England in the early 19th century. People who talk about Rochdale as the beginning of the cooperative movement kind of disregard the Owenite history, in part because it's kind of tainted with an idea of socialism, and cooperation has a kind of vexed relationship to ideas of socialism. But cooperation was the word for socialism in the early 19th century. Wow. Indeed, yes. The other thing, and so actually most of the Rochdale pioneers were Owenites, which is not a version of that history. You can find it, but it's not a version that's usually told. Because in a sense, this narrative around Rochdale means that we kind of abandon these, like, so what they were doing was setting up like communes to build the future utopia. And so it wasn't very much about kind of practical everyday form of cooperation. It was like, let's set up these kind of separatist communities where we can build a kind of radical alternative utopian life. And then other kinds of cooperative action were about raising money to create those. That's kind of what the ONItes did. And so I think in part because of some kinds of politics that were happening in the mid-19th century, they wanted to distance themselves from the ONItes. And so there's a kind of forgetting that happens, that actually the pioneers themselves were ONItes. They'd had kind of political training of a kind, and this was not kind of a new idea for them. It didn't just kind of come into their minds as a virtue, you know, as a result of the fact that they were hungry. And then the other thing that gets forgotten is something that, and this is what I'll focus on more, is something called the moral economy of the crowd. And that's a phrase that comes from an English historian called E.P. Thompson, who wrote this book that some people have encountered called The Making of the English Working Class. But he also wrote this great article that I would recommend anyone to read called The Moral Economy of the Crowd. And if you look further back at kind of not the first thing that we call a cooperative retrospectively, but the first kinds of organizations that were doing things, they were early flour and bread societies. And they came out of food riots, which was really common throughout 17th, 18th century. There would often be food riots, and often in response to the attempt to introduce like market mechanisms and for people to start to manipulate prices. And so, you know, you'd have a baker who was artificially inflating their prices, and at that point, in contravention of certain laws that protected prices and kept them low, and you would get a food riot, which would literally be like lots of kind of lower class people marching on down to that baker's, with like women, with one image that always stays with me is like women with loaves of bread on sticks soaked in pig's blood, marching down to the baker's, taking it over, and then selling the bread at the fair price. And so out of that, you get these kind of early flour and bread and milling societies, because it seemed a kind of natural outcrop of that, at least for people who had some resources, was to say, we'll set up our own, and we'll try to run it differently. And so you have those going kind of like 1790s is when you start to see some of those societies. And I think what's really important when we kind of look at kind of particularly the moral economy of the crowd is that the way that the state related to these kinds of organizations is so much different than what you would imagine now. So, like, there was no legal form for a cooperative, and the idea that the state would, like, regulate forms of association in that way, you know, was just not a thing. That's something that's very much a kind of modern legal technology. And so, there's kind of two key things that happen and how the state relates to those kinds of associations that I think give us the kind of basic framework of the kind of modern cooperative. One is around registration, and the other is incorporation. So the state was not in the business of like registering associations and like using that registration to give privileges, generally speaking. You know, that if you submit your articles of whatever, that you're then allowed to operate in certain ways. There's kind of just a vacuum in that space. And in terms of the working classes, one of the first things that comes about for registration is in the context of just after the French Revolution, the English state was like really scared of popular uprising. And so one of the ways in which they countered that was through these really draconian laws called the Combination Act, which prevented particularly trade unions, but technically all kinds of working class associations from existing and functioning. And at the same time that they introduced the Combination Act, they introduced the Friendly Societies Act, which like made it possible to exist with permission if you conform to a particular model. Yeah. So that's the registration bit. And then friendly societies, like in the English kind of history, co-ops kind of come out of friendly societies. And there's some overlaps between kind of friendly society law and company law that creates cooperatives eventually. The other thing is, so what I would say about registration is that like, it's kind of, like it's a way of giving privileges, but also disciplining. So it's like, we want to know about you, and we want to know what you're doing. And so here, have these rights, and that way we get to know about what you're doing. Incorporation is something that changed a lot in the 19th century. So before kind of, obviously now we use corporations for like everything. Basically before the 19th century, the only things that could be corporations were things that were really closely attached to the state. So think about like the East India Company, and like, you know, colonial missions abroad, or really big infrastructure, things like railroads. But they were a way in which like the state could kind of empower wealthy people to invest in something that would effectively increase the state's power. So incorporation and limited liability were like really closely guarded privileges, and a way of making sure that the crown could like extract money from those activities. And so that when the East India Company was colonizing India, that could be kind of an arm of the state. Yeah. So cooperatives are actually really deeply involved in how incorporation becomes something that you can acquire by registration, and that would be available as kind of a general means of kind of forming economic entities. So I want to move on to how that happened, but any questions? Sorry, this is really like quick history.
This is great. I will save my questions for a little bit later.
Yeah. Anybody else? Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, I guess I'm curious, when you say that the cooperative movement and cooperatives were part of this initial, like, building legal entities as a social construction, whatever thing, I'm just curious, like, how deeply involved they were, because this is a really compelling piece of a narrative that we could then start telling when we're talking about, like, what are legal entities? Because so much of our training to entrepreneurs is just like, what is a legal entity? Why do they exist? Here's like,
Yeah, so I'll get to that, because well, I think what's interesting is that up until kind of like the 1860s, there actually wasn't a cooperative movement. There were like societies doing these things, and some kind of like relatively disparate movements of people doing these things, but there wasn't a cooperative in that, like, there wasn't like a replicable model. That's something that comes from law. Like once there's a law for it, then it's easy to sort of roll that out more widely. And those societies that did exist up to this point were not interested in law reform. So interestingly, the law reform comes from somewhere that's quite outside the movement, and that's from a group called the Christian Socialists, which I probably don't use right, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I can use the spell.
Can people actually read the board, or should I?
Should we just stop that? Can you see it? No.
I think no, but I think it'll be useful after, like, just to follow along your logic. Yeah. It
helps me keep my place as well. So I'm like, sometimes.
Yeah. It helps me pay attention. I like the facade of knowing something's going on that I can follow.
Right. So the first thing, right. So thinking about all that history differently, and then thinking about these two elements, registration and incorporation, as being really essential to creating what we know of and think of as a cooperative, like what it takes to exist as one. The Christian Socialists were kind of middle-class reformers. They were genuinely interested in like improving the working classes, and initially for them this took the shape of like sanitation projects, infrastructure projects, but at the same time, and as you might imagine, kind of Victorian philanthropy, they didn't actually like the working classes very much. It didn't have very many nice things to say about them, and they were also, what was happening at this time, and so here we're talking about kind of 1840s, 1850s, is that there was a struggle for the franchise, for the right to vote. And the Christian Socialists did not think that the working classes were ready to vote. They didn't think they were smart enough, they didn't think they were educated or disciplined enough, and so they actively did not support the Chartist movement, the struggle for the franchise. And they also thought that the working classes needed to be trained in kind of how the market works. And they really hated kind of popular uprising of any kind. They were really scared of demonstrations. And so they're kind of motivated by this idea of like, how do we help the working classes improve themselves so that they can be ready one day for political rights? And also, how do we get them to stop rioting and doing all these things. And that was there. And so there were other org groups doing kind of cooperative type things, but the actual people who kind of created the cooperative movement in a big way and created the law for cooperative were these guys. Yeah. And so it was presented to Parliament as a way of quelling unrest, as a way of showing the working classes how markets work and how hard it is to be a capitalist, so that they would give up these kind of dreams of utopia, and they would stop agitating to be part of the political system. Yeah, they would kind of respect what they'd been told, which is that they weren't ready to be part of it. And just because they're so telling, I have a quote that I would like to read. Because it's not very hidden. You know, this is like not a controversial thing for the middle classes to be doing in the mid-19th century, oppressing working people. So let me just tell you this one thing. Okay. So they thought that even if these associations that they wanted to promote, cooperative associations, would only ever kind of be taken up by a small proportion of the working classes, they say there would be this great advantage that supposing those associations embrace only a small part of the working classes, they would have almost the same salutary effect on their minds as if they embraced the whole. The whole of the working classes would see that all such disadvantages arose, the disadvantages of their lives, arose not from law, but from the nature of the case, or from the absence of the necessary qualities in them. Therefore, those who might continue to be receivers of wages in the service of individual capitalists would then feel that they were not doing so from compulsion, but from choice. So by creating this alternative, you make wage labor seem like a choice. And then taking all the circumstances into account, their condition appeared to be then preferable as receivers of wages. That that's better, it's less of a headache. Yeah. Another one, just to give you a little bit more. I've got tons of these. So working men, once enabled to act together as the owners of joint capital, will soon find their whole view of the relations between capital and labor undergo a radical alteration. They will learn what anxiety and toil it costs to hold even a small concern together in tolerable order. What amazing difficulties there are in the way of organizing by voluntary consent that industrial discipline which capital now enforces. And what losses, what cruel disappointments in markets, what trembling uncertainties may carry off the mind of the owner of capital in painful abstraction. Operatives who through this experience will find not only their thoughts, but their sympathies enlarged. They will grow both in wisdom and clarity. Oh my God! Yeah. So, for the Christian socialists, a couple of the Christian socialists were lawyers. One of them was a company lawyer. And so his name was Jean-Luc. He was kind of pushing the hardest and most involved in the kind of parliamentary select committees that led to the creation of the first Industrial and Provident Societies Act. When we go back to, and so the point throughout the conversations in those select committees is all like I was just reading to you. But what happens is, so if we kind of go back a bit larger now to kind of more generally what was going on at that time. So private companies had the right to incorporate, but not very easily, and it wasn't being very widely taken up. And so and they didn't have limited liability. And so part of the argument for limited liability was that it would allow the working classes to invest in the economy. And so even before it was palatable to argue that like capital concerns should have limited liability, there was a lot of resistance to this idea, in part because people used to think that like the market failure was like a punishment for not being very good at business, and so it was really important to fail and fail hard. So people didn't want like commercial concerns to have limited liability for a long time, and so the Christian socialists are actually responsible for making that argument really palatable, because it was like, well, we can't, the working middle classes and their small savings, they need to be able to invest them in the market and not lose them. So the Christian socialists are kind of responsible in some ways for kind of transforming how we think about those economic entities. And companies get limited liability first, but cooperatives are created in 1852, and they themselves get limited liability in 1862, so not too long after. And so in particular then, it's this combination of registration and incorporation with limited liability that creates the kind of economic entity that we know of as the cooperative. and also the company right around the same time. And you can't really separate those two kind of conversations. And so retrospectively, we're like, okay, cooperative, this happy feeling, gets kind of like merged with this history, and all of these kind of disciplinary, depoliticizing effects of creating a legitimate thing that you could be within the law get kind of forgotten, and we just see it as the birth of this thing that we love, which is the cooperative, as opposed to something that was kind of disciplining these kind of utopian socialist tendencies and disciplining this moral economy of the crowd, while also like basically inventing a way of regulating the population. Yeah, there you go. That's the nutshell. Yeah, and then yeah, some things happen later, but that's the kind of that's the kind of keep it.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I guess my kind of general, and I'm happy to take any questions about this. I can answer. I'll try to answer. But I've been trying to figure out, like, what does this tell us now? Do you know, what do we do with this? Because I think, and I've said this to a bunch of you who I interviewed, you know, you might read my work and think that, like, I don't think co-ops are a good idea because of this history. And that's not what I think. They can obviously be used in all kinds of ways. But I worry in particular about kind of how these structures of registration and incorporation, and particularly how incorporation makes us think about how we are together as a kind of collectivity, limits our thinking about what sustainable economies look like and the legal structures that should support them. But I don't think there's an easy translation into something we can pursue practically, because these structures are so ingrained in our ability to do anything economically. And so yeah, I'm curious about how this might resonate with things that you've seen or experienced, what you think. That's kind of it.
Yeah. I think it maps on one of the things that I have a lot of questions, but one of the things that it immediately like triggers for me is that whenever a group is like, it's not incorporated, and they come to us and they want help, I'm like, I have no idea how to structure a client engagement letter with this amorphous, unincorporated thing. And I just end up like naming an individual, and I'm like, I guess you're my client because I can't do anything else. And I think that there is a large ability that I just truly don't know what to do as an attorney when it's like a real, like a social movement that's not authorized by any state form that comes and wants help.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, yeah, that's kind of a product of how ingrained that structure is in kind of how we think about law, legal responsibility, all of that. Like, the law really kind of needs like an entity to hold all of these things. But interestingly, before this, it didn't really, you know. So like, what would often apply, if anything applied, was like the laws of partnership. So you just basically, like, the law would see these things as like big partnerships, which obviously created a lot of difficulties. And the way that the history is often told, and the role of the law, was that like it was hard to cooperate because there was no limited liability, and like it's this very kind of present way of looking at that history. Like, limited liability was not the obvious answer to that question, nor was greater regulation like an answer to that question. But yeah, but I don't know, because like that means that like, you know, I've like gone around in circles about this as well. Like, I don't think we can tell people not to incorporate. Like, I don't think that's necessarily because like it's so hard to do anything if you're not incorporated.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of historical thing, but maybe not irrelevant. So this idea of like the need to fail, so that what sort of, you know, this idea of, which presumably dates back to earlier liberalism, that the market needs failure to grow. So you see that in Hayek, so he's like an arch neoliberal, like later, where you see the shift to kind of where we are with neoliberalism. Like for him, the market, and it also goes right the way down to the individual. You have to have accidents and you have to have failures. People drop off the wagon, they can't get welfare, they can't get a job, that's necessary for our economy to grow. But I'm wondering how that relates to the present or the later period of cooperativism. We're talking briefly about failures. like, do you see a shift in the later stages from like early liberal to neo to where we are? Does the market still need cooperatives to fail? Like, is it still bound up in that process? I don't know.
I think there's, I mean, in terms of then needing to fail, I think there's a kind of belief that they would always be marginal. And we could talk about kind of later things that happened in history when they were not so marginal and had to be kind of put back again with other legal interventions.
Yeah.
But going back to like, so this shift where failure was necessary is also about a shift in the relationship between Christianity and kind of market economics. So here it was like you fail and you need to have that punishment. Like the market is kind of a retributive force. To when you get registration, what holds people accountable is not punishment, but public accountability. So like that your accounts need to be made public, that like people should be able to look up what you're doing and make informed choices. So rather than it being about punishment, it becomes about surveillance and information.
Yeah, and law becomes a crucial part of that surveillance exercise.
Yeah, this is a whole different regulatory regime, you know, from here to here. Yeah, this is like, yeah, you fail, everyone suffers. That's what God wanted. This is, we want people to succeed and be able to make kind of prudent choices. And this is a bit too that's supposed to kind of develop the characters of the working classes. That's like they have to be like outstanding. They want people to participate in their co-ops and be successful on the market. So it has this like disciplinary effect in that way.
How do you see that disciplinary? Oh, I'm muted. Oh no, because I've seen this. Like right now, I'm reading a history of workers' control across the world in like the early 20th century, and this idea comes up all the time in different countries, in Russia and different places, that allowing the workers to take control, just like give them what they want, they're going to fail and they're going to learn that what they were wanting all along is bad. But then they succeed many times. And so I know that there is that, I mean, there's that narrative that, and the framing that I guess the upper classes that are allowing this to happen are giving to it, but how do you match that with the sort of way that the working class is just taking that and saying, we don't really care? Like, does it?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of things, like, well, so one is like looking at the history, like the thing around, so some of the stuff from what you're asking, but I just remembered something that I wanted to say about that, which is like the working classes didn't care about limited liability. I think I said this to Ricardo yesterday when we were talking, was that if you look at, like, they interviewed a few, like, kind of working class people in the select committee reports, and what you see is, like, when they're talking about limited liability, it's much more about facilitating middle class investment in those projects. They were worried about losing their money in co-ops, but, like, the working class people who were often, like, the ordinary members of those organizations were like, we don't have anything anyway. Please come take the little bit of money that I have. Like, it doesn't make a difference to us. And they would have preferred perhaps not to be regulated, you know, like this wasn't a benefit that they needed. Going to kind of success, I don't know, well, because I increasingly think that, like, you know, it's about what the cooperative does and not so much the structure. But I would question, I guess, what we think success looks like, because at least in the UK, cooperative success is business success, it's commercial success, with very little examination of the substance of that. So like the cooperative group is wildly successful by commercial measures. Is it a very good co-op? Not really. You know, like membership is very superficial. They have, you know, their employees are just workers on minimum wage. You know, like you could meaningfully ask, like, is this actually something different? But they're very successful because they're commercially successful. And so I think that's a little bit of a trap of like, because like a cooperative is a market, it's an entity that was created to facilitate, you know, a market effect in the same way that a company was. I think also, and I'm obviously familiar with the UK history more than anything else, but I'd be interested to see other examples of when they do start to be successful on kind of non-market terms, that becomes quite threatening. And so the argument that happened in the UK in kind of like the early 20th century was basically to say that like there's an unfair advantage that cooperatives have. They weren't being taxed in the same way as companies in particular. And so there were like associations of private traders basically saying like these are uncompetitive entities. The rules around taxation were changed and it really kind of cut into the cooperative movement. It made them start to franchise and centralize, and that's where the cooperative group comes from, this kind of like massive cooperative corporation thing. So I don't know, I don't think, but I think, when you look at Mondragon, they have to compromise around some commercial stuff as well. Like part of how they remain economically viable is to have business arms that are not co-ops in other countries. But also, what helps to make them successful is that they have a very supportive relationship with the Basque state. So they're not kind of on a kind of even competitive playing field or something like that. So it's not quite the same as just like some cooperative starting and trying to, so if you create like, I don't know, a cooperative grocery store and you have to compete with, I don't know, name a supermarket here. I can't remember what they're called. Safeway, and that's really hard to do. And it is meant to fail, right? So unless you can kind of change the actual structure of the market or really change what we think about as success as well and move away from commercial success. I feel like Janelle heard you talking about this a little bit, but like maybe 1/3 of the income should just be grants, and that's okay. This isn't something that's supposed to be viable in a market, because what is that anyway? But something that's deeply unfair. But sorry, that's a really long-winded answer.
That's a good one. Thank you.
For me, I think what's coming up for me is, I think what I really appreciated about Jay's work, or his framing of it, when he wrote out some content. I asked him like, hey, give me some like content so we can put a website or a web page up so people can know what you're doing. And then what was it? And then it's all talking about the critique of ownership and how all of, both within the context of cooperative conversions, and targeting business owners as opposed to the employees as the primary audience of people that you're trying to like bring in to convert the business to a worker co-op, but also around ownership as a term that we should be promoting. And so I think this type of history and showing where it has led and sort of the disciplining effects and all these types of things is something that like if and when you publish your materials or it's like it can provide us who have a critique of some of the work that's being done in the worker co-op space to be able to come back with like, here's an historical analogy of what we're recreating. So like, let's be a little bit more reflective of how we're approaching this work in a way that's like, if we're talking about building worker power and whatever, like all the other things that we're trying to do. So
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just a thought.
Yeah. So I guess because one of the things that stays with us is not just a kind of regulatory structure where when we're creating these projects, we're always making them kind of beholden to the state in one way or another, but it's a kind of ideological packaging that comes with accepting the underlying premise of the market. And I think that's what I see a lot of in the UK is that they don't really want to question the market bit of that, when, to me anyway, like the market's not real. It's entirely a construct. So it's a weird thing to kind of base your anything off of. And that idea of the market is something that was kind of born around this time and implemented in this way, through the creation of entities that could kind of compete in this imagined space of the market. You need these like self-contained collections of people and companies and co-ops that can then, exist. Yeah, I have a whole like in the thesis that I wrote, it goes all the way back to like the history of the body corporate and where that comes from, and like the shift from like the body corporate comes from like the medieval church, and so thinking about how like the kind of metaphysical imagination that comes with like incorporation. I think kind of combination of like the body of Christ and angels flying around in this like space that is the market.
Whoa.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm trying to think about examples of co-ops that have been successful but then hindered by the law once they become successful, or trying to think of examples.
Yeah.
I just was thinking about, sorry, the opposite. So the co-op group was recently almost collapsed. And I wondered, so it became this big thing. I was a co-op banking customer, like, you didn't even, I mean, I sort of picked it for that reason, but it was a big bank on the market doing really well, amongst other things. And so it lost any real identity with any kind of meaningful cooperative values. And I wondered whether your analysis of its subsequent collapse, where it essentially turned into a hedge fund, and like people left in droves, do you think that was in the end because it didn't have any kind of staying power once its market commercially wasn't doing well? It also had no staying power for its membership. Like there was no reason to hang on.
Well, I mean, they weren't really given a choice. But it's interesting because all the kind of business analyses of why that happened said it was because it's a co-op.
Okay.
And because like those democratic decisions really held them back. And like I think they were doing what every other, large corporate entity does, which is they were trying to take over another bank, got greedy, and it didn't go well.
Yeah.
But like if you read like kind of the editorials at the time, they were all like, democracy in the economy is not effective.
Right. But the massive outflux must have been partly to do with people feeling like it's not even worth sticking around.
Well, yeah, because I think a lot of people did, identify on some level, even if kind of superficially, with kind of cooperative values.
Yeah.
And I think, there's been, I don't know, kind of a loss of faith in the cooperative group that was kind of a long time coming, actually.
Yeah.
What you described as a cooperative group, it reminds me of the Berkeley cooperatives, the network of cooperatives that included a bank and a gas station, multiple grocery stores and a drugstore, that mostly collapsed with a few vestiges remaining. And someone did write a book. Has anybody read the book by John Curl, trying to analyze what it was and why it all went down? But I mean, what I've heard people say, because there was an exhibit on it too, is just like that it was the lack of democratic participation that made it fall down, which is good. It's just sort of saying like, yeah, it started to act like a normal business. It was competing with normal businesses like Whole Foods and Safeway, and people didn't have a sense that it was any different than those businesses, and they weren't engaging in any meaningful way or actively shaping it anymore, and that's why it went down, which I like that theory.
Makes sense. I think that's right. Yeah. And also, too, I mean, I think some of it too, like, I've wondered about the idea of like, if the market is the playing field on which a lot of cooperatives are having to function, paradoxically, the kind of limitations imposed by cooperative law that are meant to guarantee instant democracy, asset locks or whatever, can prevent them from being able to do that successfully. That's where like the kind of, like if we presume that as the playing field, then the things that we value most about those organizations potentially are the things that hold them back from being able to compete with private companies. I don't know that it has to be that way. But there winds up being this kind of self-limitation. And at least, like I was part of something called the People's Supermarket in London, and they were really railing against that. And a lot of the reform conversations in the UK are about lifting certain restrictions so that co-ops can behave more like businesses, because it's seen as kind of unfair that co-ops can do, I don't know, have, limitations on share size and things like that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I have to jump off. Tara, thank you so much for all of this. I really appreciate it. It's very powerful for me. So thank you.
But you were recording it.
No, I know. I already switched over. Jay's now recording it.
Oh, cool. Thanks.
So we'll stitch it together after this.
Yeah, I might try to like write it up in an accessible way.
Oh, that'd be neat.
That would be helpful.
Yeah.
I'm curious about, are we popcorning?
Yeah.
I'm curious about the quote that you were reading, and one of the advantages that they were talking about was, if we give these people the opportunity to cooperate, they're going to learn how hard it is to govern by consent, and then they're going to flock back to the hierarchy in industry, the hierarchies of industry. How long has that been a narrative? It's like why is there I just feel like that's a theme that runs throughout history about how governing by consent is not a viable way to make decisions that actually make an organization, I don't know, viable.
I don't know. So I think when the market was conceived as something retributive, like no one cared if the working classes participated or not. And so I think this idea that like the way that they want to do things and their kind of visions for what they would like to do are going to be hard, and that we need to let them experience how hard it is to do that and how hard it is to be a capitalist is something that comes with the kind of political economy of the mid-19th century. Because even though they're working in a context that's ostensibly democratic and like pushing for the franchise, and so there is a sense that like government is something by consent. Who is participating in that consent is obviously very much contested, but yeah, I don't know. I think the idea that things could be done more fairly or more cooperatively was just I don't know. I don't think I'm answering your question very well, but I don't know why I guess because they'd had some experiences of failures as well, that like that's part of why they thought it would be hard to do that and hard to keep people participating in things. But yeah, it's really when we kind of shift like the understanding of what the market's supposed to do and how it's supposed to function that seems to become a concern. Before that, no one's particularly interested in kind of these working class associations.
I think one of the things that maps onto for me is, in terms of a history, that I've only recently learned that it's sort of what you were talking about with the body corporate, like what that is in general, is learning the history of why democracy is so connected to this idea of the people in a social contract, where the people is sort of this fictitious, homogenous thing. It's just one thing that's not real, that is given that you have this sense that it's something that can actually act. And that's kind of like what a corporation is. It's this fictitious thing that is reducing this plurality of things into this one thing. And I only recently learned this history, that there was like a real debate about what is the best way to conceive of the people that operate in a democracy and how a democracy operates. And there was this real fight between the concept of the people, which is sort of this unifying thing, and the concept of the multitude, which is this like, it's basically just like this mess of people. It's like, there was an idea that democracy has to function according to sort of this fiction of having a singular will. And I feel like that has to play into how cooperatives even are conceived these days.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that's a harder thing to kind of spell out the consequences of, or like what we do with that kind of critique. Because I think part of the disciplining kind of effect of the cooperative is that it kind of isolates people in a way that, and I think we more easily articulate it as a critique of individualism, that if we see people as atomized individuals, that leads to kind of an impoverished understanding of, human social life and how we can work together. And I think you can apply the same thing to kind of these unified collectivities that the law requires. Like that's equally problematic because we can't see the way that they work together and overlap and blend and, but if the law like requires us to see them as isolated things and then very deliberately like patch out those connections in order to maintain those lines of responsibility, that creates problems for a broader kind of cooperative vision.
Janelle, that sounds like what you've been talking about, and I've been talking about it recently on antitrust. This inability to actually cooperate across cooperatives.
Has this been a part of your analysis, antitrust law?
No, but I'm totally gonna look at it now.
Yeah, I call it anti-cooperation law now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of felt, yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, I think that the body corporate is such a weird thing, and like that's kind of how we learned. Like, so if you go back about like how do we conceive of kind of collective ownership or like abstract forms of ownership, not just an individual, you would get things like something being owned by a saint would often be what kind of like medieval churches did. And so we kind of, yeah, moved from being like, this is owned by Saint so-and-so to a conception of the incorporated entity.
Huh.
Like the way that you could own something in perpetuity would be to attribute it to a saint. It's like actually owning that thing. Or it would be a specific collective in a specific place, you know, and like, so it was really hard for like people at the time, like kind of philosophers and scholarly types, as well as law, to conceive of kind of an enduring, abstract, collective entity that could own something over time. Like, it's just like a struggle for a while to get to that. So you find, yeah, these kind of weird, actual supernatural things being referred to.
Wow. This is all blowing my mind.
Yeah, once you start digging, that's why it took me 8 years to write this thing. So I was like, there's more. Oh my God. Wait, medieval property holding. What? And then like, you know, you just like keep on digging.
I love it. I'm visualizing things in my head now. Yeah, there's the atomized people, and then atomized entities. All of the different law, in addition to antitrust law, all the different laws that regulate how they must collaborate with or not collaborate with each other. You know, it's almost like the forces of magnetism that draw them together, push them apart, including like all of the ways in which certain entities need to transact at an arm's length with other entities, and everything around like conflict of interest and confluence of interest. It's creating in many cases an unnatural separation between two things when in fact they would be much stronger together and both benefit, and everyone would benefit if they were sort of benefiting each other. If that makes sense. So
yeah. And what's hard is like that's just the foundation on which that regulatory space has been built. Because like if you go back like to the earlier period that I was talking about, like that just wasn't a space that was regulated. So you didn't have to deal with those kinds of questions. The state wasn't really interested in what those associations were doing. And so aside from like some basic provisions of property law, you know, you could have something as an amorphous collective or whatever, just because there wasn't a law there that kind of said you had to do it in a particular way. And so I think in terms of some of the ways that you guys talk about law and using the law to kind of create the things that we want, I really feel like, I mean, you must encounter this a lot in what you do, like, we don't know what that is, you know, like the tools that we have from kind of traditional law are so limited that like, it's hard to imagine, like, what is the law for an amorphous collective that allows them to, you know, like, what does that even look like?
And we do have unincorporated association laws, or what you were saying, partnership laws, the default. I'm a little worried that right now that we could be experiencing a shift. California passed this law called 85, which really much more broadly defines who is an employee, and it captures a lot of people who didn't used to be an employee. And we support all these cooperatives that they tend to be immigrant-owned worker collectives formed as LLCs, which are effectively treated like partnerships, but do have the limited liability. And so traditionally, the owners of the managing owners of those were not considered employees. But we had a Department of Labor Standards Enforcement hearing officer recently say, I've never heard of such a thing. And we're like, what? You've never heard of people going into business for themselves? You've never heard of people like forming associations or partnerships to do business together? And I think their default is going to just be like, anytime anyone does something with anybody else, there needs to be an employer-employee relationship. It just sort of feels like they're starting to delve into forms, like less formal kinds of associations, and then forced formality onto them.
Yeah, I would argue that there's actually discrimination in that analysis, because they don't, if you had four rich white guys that are talking about business ownership, there's no way somebody at the EDD is going, oh, one of you must be an employee. No, it's because people, and it's the forum that they're in. They're talking about this in terms of a government agency that was created to protect employees. So they find employees where none exist in order to protect them. Honestly, I think it's a really horrible venue for getting those legal determinations to come out of, because they they look wrong. They don't have enough money to be business owners. They can't, it's like, I've never heard of such a thing. It's right. That's exactly what that person was saying. What? A bunch of immigrants owning a business together? I mean, honestly, it just makes me crazy. Sorry, go ranting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and even, because even like the law really struggles with unincorporated associations. Like one, we can't do all that much with them, really.
Like borrow money.
Or at least, yeah. So the second you want to like get insurance or, when you want to start doing anything more, but also there's always these the language around them always kind of implies a collective unity. Like I know obviously responsibility can be distributed amongst them in terms of legal liability, but the way that they're spoken about, it's like there's a kind of informal incorporatedness.
That's true.
Like the law just can't cope.
Yeah, it's like everything needs to be a thing. If it's not a thing, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, it needs to be a thing in this very particular way.
Or it does exist and it's threatened. So that's the
big
problem. Anything that it can't identify as a legal subject in some way becomes a threat to the law. It's how it constructs itself.
Right, and it's always interesting to me that all corporation laws require officers of something to this, well, at least that I know of, president, secretary, treasurer. So there's always a who's in charge here. So even within the corporation, you can't have any nebulousness around is there someone in charge? No, it almost forces there to be sort of an external point person.
They also, your angelic medieval history. There's a strong element of the medieval history of oikonomia as well, of the economy overall. So you get this idea of messengers, which was angels, and the angelic order were messengers across the hierarchies. So you see those things replicated in bureaucratic, administrative, and then governance forms.
Yeah.
Which had early theological frameworks and just get redeployed, kind of rehashed into so the officer class was actually very much to do with the angelic order.
Yeah. Oh wow.
I love how much the angels are still with us. They apparently live in perpetuity.
They're going strong.
They have a life of their own in this mythology that underlies so many things.
Well, the existence of corporations is the same as how angels were imagined. So something that has a birth but no death. So angels have to come into existence at some point, but they don't die. And that was literally the early jurists were angels, corporations. It's really direct in terms of how we learn to imagine these kinds of legal concepts.
Huh.
Yeah. I guess I wonder, actually, something I wanted to ask you guys is, do you have any examples of people undermining some of those structures? You have to adopt the structure with the secretary, treasurer, director, or whatever that is. Do you have any, I don't know, what if somebody wanted to, make the treasurer their dog? Or something like that. I don't know, is that, how would you be able to do that?
I mean, kind of in the consultation we had yesterday. I won't name them because not everybody, well, I guess everybody was in there, except Lisa, maybe. They basically wanted to make all of those public officials as anonymous as possible. And we were like, you can do that. And we've got other clients that come in and are like, I don't want anybody to know who I am. I want to live off the grid. I don't want anybody to know me. And they do it. And I think it's kind of similar to the way that real estate works, at least here, is you have all of these shell companies and everybody hides who they are and no one can know. So it's sort of that's accessible if you have enough money.
Yeah.
But at a lower level, it's harder to do, at least.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel since there's precedent for corporations to be people, I feel you could always fill in the name of an LLC to be an officer, right, of a corporation, and then that LLC can be owned by 5 other LLCs, and I don't know how far into infinity you can go with that.
Right. Probably pretty far.
I gotta go. Thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Thanks for attending. It's really nice to be able to talk with you. Thanks.
Did we set aside an hour and a half for this?
What time is it now?
It's 1:30. Yeah. Are you sticking around, Jay?
Yeah, I can stick around. I put an hour and a half on the schedule for it.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, only if there's more that you guys want to talk about.
There is, but sometimes it's like so, I mean, it's like, in many ways this is blowing my mind so much. I don't even know how like to put things to words yet, but
yeah,
which is awesome.
I think that when you look at these kind of like histories and genealogies, that's one of the things that it doesn't easily lend itself to like, so what? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges is like, how do you redeploy some of this stuff to like, to some sort of specific analysis of like how you can, I don't know, Tara, you've just thought so much more about it. But when you think of like subversions, like the example of the kind of dog, like, because these are such deep historical roots, like what does it leave you with beyond understanding a bit more, like to start a process of subversion, new tactics and strategies? I mean, I find that really hard to I'm not sure it's meant to be easy, by the way, but I don't know where you would take it.
Yeah. But I feel it's a big reason why I wanted to come here, was I had a strong feeling that helped me
See subversion in action?
Yeah. Well, both see where these things become problems, the things that you guys are trying to do, which is a lot of the questions I was trying to ask in the interviews, was trying to hear some of that, as well as how you guys think about those things. But just to, that if we put each other in the same conversation, we might start to see. Because I don't know, because in part, I think because I've never been in practice, and I'm not a lawyer, there's so much stuff that I don't know. So like the antitrust stuff, it wouldn't have really immediately occurred to me. But now that you say it,
you gotta add another year to your dissertation now.
Yeah.
Delve into that for us.
Yeah. No, well, thank God, that's all done. But like, I want to know now where to take it.
Yeah.
And so, because I think the history on its own is interesting, but if I can do a proper job of kind of taking it back to the present and showing how these deep structures create big problems for realizing kinds of like visions that you guys have. Yeah. Assuming that's, it feels like that's a line of causality, but
for sure.
Yeah.
Fleshing it out.
Yeah, I like the idea of you writing something like in a short form. And if that's the thing we can get our heads around, it almost feels like conducive to a cartoon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it would be like the anti-Rochdale Pioneers cartoon or something like that. It's just maybe very popular in some circles.
Oh, do you think so?
I don't
but
know.
I mean, you don't come off as being anti-Rochdale. You're just like, you're not holding them up as like the, it's not your religion.
Yeah.
Like it is so many people. I've been in a meeting in this room with co-ops talking a co-op. Well, it was East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, and they were trying to come up with their points of unity and values, and all kinds of things related to equity and justice. And at some point, this woman, she's like, and it was the way that she said it that really cracked me up. She's like, when are we going to talk about the Rochdale principles? And she was angry. It was like this anger building up inside of her, and she's sort of an old school co-op activist.
Right.
So I was just like, wow, that's intense. And I have to be honest, I almost never use them myself because they somehow just don't speak to me intuitively the way that they're phrased. So, and there's too many of them. Who can remember 7 things?
Yeah.
I don't know. Does anybody have thoughts about those principles? Like, how useful are they? Like, should we try to use them and educate people about them and continue to treat them as the thing? Or
I know some people who are doing interesting things with them. I think they're inherently very good.
Yeah.
Like if you really stress the cooperate with other cooperative things, for example, like I think that can have some traction.
Yeah.
And I know like they've been adjusted in controversial ways historically as well. Like I forget which one's not there anymore that used to be. But like, I don't know, there's something there if you want to talk about the imperative, like the education part or open democratic membership. They don't find that they speak to me.
Yeah, I did an introduction to cooperatives presentation where our normal one that we do, our introduction to cooperative sort of session, uses the Rochelle principles and just runs through them really quickly. And I changed it a little bit. So I was talking about like, what would it look like if we organized our political system around these principles? Like, how would it change the way that our democracy works if it was organized based on these principles? And you can get to things like open borders, and you can get to like all kinds of things like using these principles to critique.
Oh.
I don't know. I think it's interesting. That was just me. I'm always, I said this right here, I'm always playing with the political economic distinction and like trying to cross that boundary. So I think that they're somewhat useful to do that. This is like a basis, not anything innate about them, but yeah.
I think maybe part of what I don't like about them is that, like, you don't have to have like kind of like good critique of existing society in order to think they're good. Like, right, they can be interpreted as being, I don't know, quite friendly set of principles, which I think, is important to some extent, but they don't necessarily, so like, I don't know, the cooperative group, that's my kind of example of bad things, can perfectly happily say they tick all those boxes. They don't need to have a critique of capitalism. They don't have to, like, people in the cooperative movement in the UK still write books where they think like cooperation was the good part of the empire, and you're like, I think the empire was just bad. I don't think, so you don't have to have like a critique of like racial injustice. You don't have, and like you can perfectly well fit within. And I think you could interpret those principles in more radical ways that would make you have to question some of those things. But on the face of them, as part of it is a language thing. I think they're in this language that it lacks teeth in terms of saying like, actually, if you're going to embrace cooperative, you really kind of have to be anti-capitalist. You need it. And like, I think the ICA would never go anywhere near something like that.
Interesting.
I think, and that's part of, that's part of why I wanted to come and talk to you guys, because it's really clear that a kind of anti-capitalist politics seems to animate and motivate what you do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or like, what did I say? Decolonize, decarbonize, decommodify?
Yeah.
I was like, cha.
Yeah.
That's obviously,
Yeah.
and again, that's not, at least, in the UK,
No.
that's not the conversation. Some people are having that conversation in relation to co-ops and like solidarity economy, but not the like movement.
Yeah. I don't think, Janelle, you can speak to this because you've been here longer, but I don't know, we haven't adopted anything that explicitly says that, and I think we've had conversations about that. I know organizations like the New Economy Coalition struggled, and like there was a struggle there where they wanted to explicitly come out and say we are anti-capitalist, and they had to like go through a lot of process and get there, and they finally got there where they're like, we can say this. And I don't know that, I think those principles animate us a lot of the work that we do, but I don't know that everyone that works at SELC has those, would say that they are that anti-capitalist. So it's an interesting thing to layer on top of us, and I think a lot of people do it, but I don't know that we necessarily are like all politically there.
I go back and forth as well, because sometimes I like the ambiguity politically around co-ops, because it means people get involved in them and kind of learn by doing it, and don't necessarily get kind of put off by like inflammatory political language or whatever. But at the same time, like, there's a lot of appropriation of cooperative projects.
Yes.
When I started the thesis, the Tories were doing this big society thing, and the co-ops thought that like the Tories were speaking to them with this idea of the big society. There's a lot of talk about empowering co-ops and that sort of thing. One of the things that happened when I was at the People's Supermarket was like David Cameron came and was like, this is the way forward, and it caused this like huge battle amongst the membership. Who was like, who took that call? Who invited him here? And then and then people being like, are we political or aren't we political? And what does that mean?
Wow. And
I was like, but there's no planet on which like David Cameron is actually interested in the thing we're trying to do. Like whatever one, like any kind of Tory.
We're there in the U.S. too. I don't know. Yasi talked about some of the policy, but there is a lot of some of the bigger scale like worker policy around worker co-ops right now is coming with bipartisan backing. Yeah. Fairly like divergent sides of the spectrum. So there's those conversations are active, but in a way I think pretty muted. At least I haven't heard them come to the surface.
Yeah.
like bubble all the way.
Jackson is quite explicit, aren't they, about their anti-capitalist.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just something to be really careful about, like that palatability and ability to speak to both sides is really important, but I think, you know, that underlying commitment to like economic democracy and justice, like is at some point kind of problematize all of that.
Yeah. I gave a presentation at San Francisco Foundation a couple of weeks ago where and they kept saying, can you come present to us about cooperatives? And I was like, can you stop calling this a presentation about cooperatives? Because it's about so much more than that, and cooperatives mean so many things. So I got them to change the title of it. And I have this elephant graphic where there's all these blind people touching an elephant that says, it's shaped like the word cooperative. Anyways, to just say, cooperatives can mean so many things. So let's instead talk about, like, what is it that we want to support? And I use that 3-part framework of organizations that spread wealth, spread power, and then root that wealth and power in community control permanently. And so then when I did that, and I presented using that framework, and then also talking about, well, comparing that to the dominant economic system of concentrating wealth and power, at the end, this woman came out to me and she said, how did you do that whole thing without ever saying the word capitalism? So I don't know, but and it's so, and people were like, oh yeah. Like it is intuitive to people. I think the problem with the word capitalism, the problem with the word co-op is people have all kinds of different conceptions about what both of them mean, and so if we can boil it down to something that people as human beings can be like, I see the benefit of that now, and and I don't think our coworkers, even if they don't position themselves as anti-capitalist, I don't think that they would position themselves as anti-spreading wealth and power. So
and so I would agree that like the words themselves are not so important. And sometimes you can have like a much more inclusive conversation if you talk about things for what they are, as opposed to in like kind of already coded political language. And also, you know, I think it's like the small scale kind of like what happens in those kinds of organizations can then be quite transformative. Like, I don't know, like there were a lot of like right-wing people in the co-op that I was part of in London, and like it would lead to conflict and tension, but also like interesting conversations that I think a lot of those people probably wouldn't have been having otherwise, like you know, the rights of our trans members, and like, you know, that like on a national scale, politically they would be like allergic to and would never think about necessarily. Suddenly becomes like a meaningful local conversation that they're interested in, and like they happen to really like our trans members, and like it makes them, you know, like I was like, oh, that's, you know, when I was part of that, I was like, wow, that's really powerful. And so I wouldn't want to.
Making sure that's not somebody locked out. I don't think so. So has anybody read Reinventing Organizations?
No.
By Frederick Lalo. Yeah, Jay has. Okay, so and you might have heard of this framework even if you haven't read the book. A sort of evolution of organizations from red to orange, I can't remember what it was, to green to teal. Red being like very strictly fixed hierarchies like the Catholic Church or something like that. Something in the orange-amber range of being more merit-based hierarchies organizations. Green being highly equitable, consensus-based, everybody sitting in a circle trying to make decisions together kind of organizations, like 60s communes type of things. And then teal being the next level or layer or whatever of evolution of organizations, being decentralized, participatory, so not everybody all sitting in a circle making decisions together, but sort of that the activities and decisions are being sourced from many places in many small groups through some sort of coordinated system of constant feedback between all those groups so that it's coordinated, but not from any kind of top-down level and not as a whole group. And so that's kind of how I would describe our organization, a lot of the organizations we're creating. And why did I say that? Because I think it's going to start to present problems for what it does seem like our legal system wants to do. It's like find the thing. Who's in charge here?
Yeah.
You know, create a thing, draw a circle around it, find the person in charge of it. And you can now like find organizations where it's like, what's happening where and how is it happening? And I don't know, that could be a powerful thing. The way it works in our organization is the board has agreed to like delegate to this decentralized system that we have. I will say that over time, the board gets a little bit more nervous about all the things that happen under its umbrella or under its oversight, and feeling its responsibility, like legal duties as a board, is to be like directing it or controlling it a little bit more.
Yeah.
Whereas I really think the magic of our organization is like the ability of any staff member to kind of initiate or conceive of a project and then join with others to make something happen, and then the board. But now it's the board sometimes reacts.
Fiduciary risk because there's the growth of financial transactions.
Yeah, and they do have a duty of care to pay attention.
Yeah. And do they find it harder to pay attention in a decentralized situation?
I think so. Yeah, and we've tried to create a good system where they know everything that's going on, but it's hard because things develop very quickly. I mean, it's hard to gather them all into one place and know everything that's happening in our organization.
If you weren't here, or you were, indisposed for a chunk of time, or would there be more risk of that nervosity?
There would. I think there are certain individuals who have a sort of natural propensity to hold the big picture and tie a lot of things together, and we have at least one other coworker who does that naturally. But there are times when it's necessary, but it's more necessary, and we actually had a conversation about what's the role of an executive director, because why do I have that title when I have no more power than any of my other coworkers? And it's more for an external explanation of people look for an executive director, but also there's an expectation that the executive director knows what's going on, knows what the funding needs are, and so, but yeah, what if there wasn't anybody who didn't know everything that was happening? It would still be kind of okay, except for the corporate law, so the board needs to see it all and intervene if they think it's going off course.
Yeah, because if you just think even the sort of legal financials where they really like condense or are most emphatic is the bits about the decision-making processes and the hierarchy of the decision-making processes around those particular questions of financial risks and risk management. And it almost can't do without it, right? So it's like who can answer because who's got, who does the banking authorization, who, presents the budget, like, that in a sense, but it's mad because you can't really all those other operational roles are so critical, but it needs to identify those things, I think, whether, you're decentralized or not. I think it just demands of that.
Yeah. We try to centralize it. We had a board meeting last night. We have 4 different board liaisons, each with a different role of reporting to a different board member about everything that's going on. So in theory, they get access to all the information about what's going on, but no, in reality, they don't. Because it's so dynamic and so fast-paced and so distributed. And that's the beauty of it. And I think that is in many ways, that's power that I think similar organizations can have, is that less subject to state control, less subject to hierarchical control, because you just can't put your finger on all the things. I recommend that book. There's also sort of a graphic cartoon version of it.
Who's the author?
Frederick Laloux, Laloux.
Oh, right, great. Yeah.
There's also a lot of people who are obsessed with, and there's even a phrase that I keep hearing about distributed autonomous networks. Is that a thing? Yeah.
What's that, distributed autonomous network?
Is that what they're called, Jay?
Yeah, it's distributed autonomous organizations, or they're called like DAOs, and then there's a variation by someone we're loosely connected to. It's called a DISCO, which is distributed cooperative organization. I think something like that. Yeah.
And yeah, they come to us from time to time for legal advice of like, okay, we want to be this distributed thing. How do we put this round, multi-shaped, flower-shaped thing into this square hole of a cooperative corporation or whatever? in many ways, that's what we did with EB Prac. If you ever read their whole cartoon bylaws, we tried to do it as much as possible, like push the boundaries within the confines of a corporate entity as much as we could. But I don't know. I also can't always get my head around everything they're doing. And I kind of feel like the networks that we've talked to have kind of gotten frustrated with us of feeling like when we tell them the legal requirements, it's creating too many constraints on what they actually want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, the legal system not only likes to create things here, things there, but then to define a relationship with them, which is always almost like this, of there's one that's dominant over the other, employer, employee, landlord, tenant, producer, consumer, company, investor, and anything that's a little more,
well, that's the point about theology and kind of transcendentalism. It just gets duplicated, but it replicates a particular model of an ontology, if you like, being, which it needs to have. That's how it centers itself. It needs to have the kind of sense of the above, and you can't. It really fight against kind of a reordering of that kind, because it really just threatens the way the whole shebang works on that hierarchy and how it conceives of itself at all. It finds it very hard to do outside of that.
I would just like to know, this is maybe one of the biggest challenges we face, is that in the employer-employee context or landlord-tenant, there's all these people and there's whole movements organized around the employee or the tenant. And they're not questioning as much this relationship to begin with, the master-servant kind of relationship.
Exactly.
And then how can we actually start to build a movement that just questions that dominance relationship to begin with?
But you're doing it already, like the legal system, even the most potentially radical legal outfits completely fail to address that, because they just imbue the kind of, okay, we need more, we need rights, we need more rights, we need to access rights, we need to do well with rights, but rights as such don't undermine that problem. So you're caught in that frame and you can't think out of it. I think your work is really different, because it already starts to use questions of redeploying economy alongside law, and I think those two are like almost your critical starting points, where you can't, like, law as such, if that's your only frame, I think you've kind of pretty much had it, because you can't do different. But I think when you start to think about the question of redistribution as such, then you start to unsettle rights frames in quite an interesting way, and using just like a legal thinking of it. I think that's what makes you very interesting. Totally different way. There's no law centres that I could think of in the UK that they just are really caught, and we just need more law, we need better ways of doing law, we need just,
Yeah, I had an awful thought the other day, which was that actually, so one of the consequences of the kind of gutting of legal aid in the UK has been that there's a real kind of attrition of knowledge in the areas of traditional poverty law and social welfare law. And there's part of me that's like, I mean, in a really immediate sense, that's terrible, because people can't get help with it, that assert their rights. But part of me is like, maybe this is the moment. Like when this has happened already,
I see.
It's like maybe this is the moment where we shift.
It's going to provoke a crisis.
Well, it's happened, right?
Yeah.
And also we can't get it back. You know, no one's talking about like bringing legal aid back at all. And like, so there's this space that's been created, not of our own making. That's like, what do you feel that way?
Yeah.
Do you try to reinvest in the social welfare law, or do we? And I think you do have to do some of that, because people do need to be able to survive, and not get evicted.
But we think it's the crowdfunding, aren't we? That's the first emergence, litigation strategies based on crowdsourcing, which never happened before. These are like really new models, and they sort of happened for a few things, but like actually, they're like some subtle, nuanced beginnings of like, okay, like you're having to subvert the economy in order to think different, to do this differently, because there's no money, you know. So I think you're right. How well that works is another matter, but definitely people are having to get way more creative.
So like, I mean, I work really closely with a local, and you know, they're up for doing something more creative, and they've shifted into public legal education, and like kind of relying more, rather than relying on legal aid as they had done, relying a bit more on grant funding so that they can like pursue more interesting projects. And so that already is kind of an opening, and I wonder what it looks like for like a traditional law center to start doing some of this kind of work alongside traditional social welfare law. And you know, like if that could be some of the exciting projects they're starting to take on, and like kind of gradually transitioning, or even using some of what they get from doing that work to help subsidize what is still required in social welfare law. I don't know. Like, and I think
other models of social welfare, like poor law assistance, that have begun to think about your
about 6 years
more
ago.
solidarity economy, right?
Yeah, about 6 years ago, Michel Jacob, who's on our board, got like a Skadden fellowship. Have you heard of Skadden? Equal Justice Works. It's what a lot of public interest law students, their fellowships that they get out of law school, and it funds them for 2 years to create a project and attach it to an organization. That's what Jake got. My coworker Charlotte, or coworker Gregory. But what Michel has done, and a handful of other people we know have done, is get those fellowships to go to a conventional legal aid organization and carve out like a transactional community economic kind of practice, or community economic justice. So I could probably come up with about 7 organizations that have that now. Built in, including a couple of our fellows. There was a thing that happened, a big bank settlement, Bank of America got sued, class action kind of thing, the cypre money as they call it, or, you know, the settlement money it couldn't be paid to the whole class of people, so they paid it to bar associations, I think, that have been now distributing it out to legal organizations. But the legal organizations have to do work around like economic empowerment. And so that's what's funded the creation of these new projects within legal aid organizations.
Interesting. Right.
how would I find those?
Greater Boston Legal Services. I don't know. Yeah. Are you writing them down?
Yeah.
Legal aid organization in Dayton, Ohio. Don't know the name of it, but it's our fellow Jackie Radbaugh. There's a legal aid organization in Asheville, North Carolina called it starts with the letter P. Wait, what is it? And it's our fellow Justin Edge who created that program there. There is in Minneapolis something, actually it's not a legal aid organization, it's more of an enterprise development organization where one of our fellows, Anissa, carved out like a cooperative development practice. I'm trying to think. So then East Bay Community Law Center is where Sushil established his. Do we know of any others, Jay?
Amazing. Impressive.
One in Philadelphia that someone got a fellowship just to do, like, create an urban ag focus project.
Yeah. I don't know the origin at Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights where Sushil is now. Is that a similar story?
I don't think it is, because they actually had a community economic development or social, I can't remember what they call it, enterprise advising program. There's probably more. I think the people who would know are my coworker Charlotte or Greg in particular, or you, Jay, of just like being part of a cohort of fellows. Were there any other like transactional law fellows, a conventional legal service organization? It would be interesting to see how those things have played out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Something really has to change as well. Like what's going on with like the legal sector in the UK? Just social welfare law is not like it can't exist in the way that it has historically.
Gosh.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the great conversation and for all you've contributed to the lesson of this week. I'm going to stop recording and step out. It's been great to meet you.